Stark hoped his attack would catch the woman off guard and give him a shot at subduing her, but she appeared to anticipate his every move. Without missing a beat, she effortlessly sidestepped Stark's lunge and counterattacked with a scissor kick. A sickening crunch echoed in the still air, and Stark's dislocated leg immediately gave out from under him. His mind swam as fresh jolts of pain mingled with the paralyzing effects of the drug, and a second attempt to get to his feet only saw him fall back on the floor. Finally realizing the hopelessness of his situation, Stark curled into a ball and let out a whimper. "Please, have mercy." The woman barked out a laugh and grabbed his chin, forcing him to look at her. "You paralyzed me. You burned me with chemicals. You disabled my hands. You made me watch on television as you methodically worked your way through my entire family. You tortured me for 3 years without a single sign of guilt or regret. And then you burned my father and I alive. And now you ask for mercy? People can change. Let me show you I've changed. Tell me who helped you." Stark knew his life depended on his ability to identify the puppet master behind all of his and Nancy's suffering. But the truth was that he had no idea. He'd never been able to initiate contact, and whoever they were had kept him at a distance, providing only resources and information. Stark heaved breaths. "I can't contact them. Surely you've seen my phone records. You know the number doesn't work." The woman scoffed. "So they finally realized you're worthless and hung you out to dry. Can't say that I blame them." After a swift kick to Stark's gut, the woman gave him a smug smile and retreated down the hall. The woman stepped outside onto the deck, the wind tussling her hair as she removed her disfigured mask to unveil a strikingly innocent face. It was Rose. She dialed Jonathan, and he immediately picked up. "How did it go, Rose?" "He's even weaker than I imagined. I don't think he knows anything. Should I hand him over to the police, or are we really going to drag this out?" Jonathan sighed. "Let it go. I'll release the full video tomorrow, and then we'll deliver him to the authorities. Don't worry. We're going to make sure he has a long, terrible life in prison." The following day, Jonathan released the video in full, and it became front-page news across the nation. Stark's true depravity had finally been revealed, and with the revelation that he had personally killed the woman who raised him, speculation immediately arose that the deaths of his sister and father weren't mere accidents either. In a matter of minutes, his reputation as a gentleman who rose from tragedy to pioneer autonomous vehicles was permanently destroyed, and the world finally saw him as the monster Nancy always knew him to be. At that same moment, Rose had just finished dumping Stark in a pile of trash at the dockyard. As he crawled out of the garbage, he caught his reflection in a shard of broken glass and was stunned to see what he had become. His once elegant features had drastically altered within days. His usually clean-shaven chin now sported rough stubble. His pallid face was smudged with dry blood, and one eye was milky white, while the other was bloodshot. When he finally made it out of the trash, he collapsed onto the dock. The woman had dislocated both of his knees, making it all but impossible to walk. Just then, Stark felt a bulge in his pocket and discovered the woman had forgotten to take his phone. He pulled it out to make a call, but was interrupted by a shrill wail of a siren piercing the air. Realizing they might be coming for him, he swiftly propped himself up on one elbow and scrambled behind a nearby building. He still had one lifeline: his money. He could pay Vincent to pick him up and help him find a hiding place. Then, if he could last long enough for his legs to heal, he might have a shot at escaping. Vincent quickly answered, but before Stark could speak, he heard a stern voice behind him. "Drop the phone and put your hands up. You're hereby under arrest for the murder of Lily Johnson." Stark complied, and as they roughly handcuffed him, he let out a long, ragged sigh. It was all over. Stark's first court hearing was a few days later, and on the morning before it was scheduled to take place, Jonathan and Steve were hard at work going over transition details. It was a long, emotional meeting, and the tension only increased when Jonathan was interrupted by a call from Dr. Chang. "Mr. Davis, we finished analyzing the soil you provided, And I can't believe I'm saying this, but we've identified a compound that could potentially reverse your blood condition. Dr. Chang paused. Unfortunately, it's not an organic substance, so it had to be something added to the soil. Jonathan exhaled, struggling to control his emotions. Is there any way to extract it? To make it into medicine? Only in extremely small quantities. If we had all the soil we wanted, it would take years to extract enough to make a single dose for a man your size. We'll have to figure out a way to synthesize it, but we haven't been able to nail down that process yet. A sinking sensation tugged at Jonathan's heart. So, apart from locating the origin of this compound, we have no other options? I'm afraid so. And the sooner, the better. Once the disorder kicks in, not even this medicine could save you. Understood. Thank you, doctor. Jonathan ended the call and let out a deep sigh. Not only was his prognosis looking more and more fraught, but the revelation about the compound in the Reynolds garden could only mean one thing. James had killed his brothers, and now he was trying to finish the job. Going back more than a century, Jonathan's family had relied on the Reynolds for all their medications, as well as daily supplements that were designed for each member of the family. Jonathan's blood disorder was evidently an inherited trait, and up until his generation, the Reynolds had clearly been providing the antidote and enabling Davis men to lead long, healthy lives. So why had Jonathan's generation suddenly been cut off? The answer had been right in front of him the entire time. James wanted revenge for the death of his wife and the suffering of his daughter, all of which came about because they were rushing to save Jonathan's mother on her deathbed. Simply put, James had inherited the power to kill any Davis man without lifting a finger, and then he'd been given a reason to do it. As for Steve, he was descended from the family's maternal line, so it stood to reason that he didn't carry the same trait. That's why whoever was pulling the strings had tried to take him out in Mexico. Jonathan's mind reeled at the scope of what he had just learned, and as he re-entered the conference room, Steve clocked his unnerved expression and shot him a concerned look. What's up? Jonathan locked eyes with him. Things have changed. We need to initiate the share transfer this afternoon, and everyone needs to stop taking anything they get from the Reynolds. We've been betrayed. Steve shook his head in bewilderment. Uncle, are you sure? They've been our closest allies for generations, until James blamed us for the accident. It might be too late for me, but we can still do everything possible to protect you. Steve looked away, speechless, but Jonathan had already stepped around behind him and started pushing his wheelchair out of the room. Let's go see our lawyer. By the time all the paperwork had been signed and notarized, it was nearly evening. Steve and Jonathan made their way downstairs without speaking, and after a solemn nod, they parted ways. As Steve climbed in his car and started back home, he found himself swept into a whirlwind of emotions. For as much strife as there had been between him and Jonathan, he had always seen his uncle as something akin to invincible. Maybe it was just the way he carried himself, but even when they were at odds, Steve felt an unshakable sense that when Jonathan was around, things would be okay. Now, in a matter of weeks, everyone in the company might be looking to him to fill his uncle's shoes. As much as he had always wanted that chance, he could never shake the feeling that he might not be up to the task. When Steve arrived home, the birthday celebration for his Aunt Linda was already well underway. Sophia quickly spotted him and hurried over to help, rolling her eyes when she realized Jonathan hadn't come with him. Leave it to your uncle to skip his own family's birthday. Suddenly, Linda appeared and greeted Steve with a kiss before chiming in. I'm sure he's just busy. The company won't run itself after all. Sophia scoffed. That's what he wants you to think. But the truth is that he only visits when he needs something. Just last week, he was over here with some wild conspiracy theory about blood feuds from the past. And I heard from one of his secretaries that he's been spending less and less time at the office. Jonathan had become a sore subject with Steve's mom ever since his injury. And while Steve might have brushed off her comments in the past, his knowledge of what Jonathan was going through made him feel compelled to defend him. Don't spread rumors, Mom. We were at work all day, and it's an extremely stressful time for him. He turned to Linda. He sends his deepest apologies that he couldn't be here, but he promised to forward your gift." Sophia looked taken aback, then exhaled and gathered herself. "I understand you've always looked up to him, Steve, but your kindness doesn't guarantee his gratitude. In fact, it often invites exploitation." Steve interrupted, his voice firm this time. "What happened in Mexico was an accident. I won't sit here and let you suggest that your own brother was involved either directly or through negligence. It was an accident. That's all." Frustration pulsated in Sophia's veins, but Linda intervened before they continued. "Well, I'm just happy to see you, Steve. Now why don't we all head into the dining room for dinner?" Sophia huffed, then nodded in resignation. Steve slowly followed behind, dreading the dinner that was about to take place. Steve and his extended family gathered around the ornate dining table, and as the dinner progressed, the lively chatter evolved from Linda's childhood to the tragic loss of her husband at the age of 32, and finally to the next generation. Before Steve knew it, all eyes were suddenly on him. Sophia was the first to speak up. "Steve, whatever happened with Maria after you got back from Mexico?" Then she turned to the rest of the table. "I'm telling you, that girl was like his guardian angel while he was recovering. She refused to leave his bedside." Linda chimed in. "Sounds like true love to me. It's like I always say, you learn a person's true character when times are bad." Sophia nodded. "If you ask me, I think they're just embarrassed because they broke up. But I told them it happens all the time. I just want them to be happy." Steve sighed and finally cut in. "Everyone, please. Maria and I were never officially together, and whatever we had is in the past. It's not going to change no matter how much you pretend it will." Sophia stammered in protest. "But why did you even break up in the first place? I know you're in love with her son. You just need to—" But she was abruptly cut off by Steve's glare. "For the last time, I'm not in love with her." Steve's outburst left Sophia at a loss for words, so Linda shifted the conversation. "Well, that's okay, Steve. Most people don't marry the first girl they date. What kind of women are you interested in? I'll see if any of my friends know someone who might be a good match." Unable to resist, Sophia jumped back in. "That's a wonderful idea, Linda. After all, he's not getting any younger. By his age, his grandfather already had 3 kids." Steve's thought drifted to Maria, and his heart constricted. His mother was right that he still loved her, but she had no idea how complicated it had become. Then he suddenly remembered Jonathan's advice about his impending responsibilities. Looking after his elders, safeguarding the company, and continuing his family's lineage. At that moment, he decided he was going to put Maria behind him for good. If he was going to take over for Jonathan, he needed to get serious. Imagining what Jonathan would do in this situation, Steve set his jaw, leaned forward, and silenced the table with a raised hand. "Enough gossip. Thank you for the offer, Linda, but I can handle this on my own. Everyone else, relax. I'll find someone suitable by the end of the year." When Jonathan arrived home from his meeting with Steve, he found Nancy immersed in a novel in their bedroom. Seeing him, she promptly set it down and sprang to her feet. "There you are. I was starting to think you were never coming home." He wrapped her in his arms and kissed her on the head. "I'm sorry, darling. Today got away from me. What are you reading?" A smirk curved Nancy's lips. "It's about a hard-charging CEO who had a torrid love affair with his secretary." Jonathan laughed as he stepped over and picked it up. "Indecent disclosures. Doesn't exactly sound like Charles Dickens." "It's called entertainment. Don't judge me." Jonathan skimmed a few pages, then pointed to a line and read it aloud. "From this day forward, I own your body, Teresa." He looked back up at Nancy with a smirk. "This is what entertains you, huh?" Nancy snatched the book from him. "They're just harmless fantasies." "So I don't measure up to the fantasy CEOs?" She swatted him playfully. "On the contrary, they're a pale imitation of the real thing. It's silly, but when you have busy weeks, It makes me feel like a part of you is here with me." Her gaze drifted toward his eyes, suddenly growing concerned. "You have dark rings under your eyes." Jonathan's breath hitched. He hated for her to see him so ragged from work. Nancy pulled him toward the bed. "Sit down. I'll give you a massage." Jonathan begrudgingly sat on the corner of the bed, and Nancy stepped behind him. Her hands landed on his temples and began kneading gently, her voice a soothing balm. "There we go. Doesn't this feel better?" Her fingertips were soft, pressing with just the right amount of pressure. Each push seemed to alleviate his tension a little more. But the tenderness of her touch left a lump in Jonathan's throat, and his reply came out rough with emotion. "It's much better. Thank you." As Nancy's hands traced from his temples to the space between his eyebrows, to the base of his skull, a cocktail of emotions simmered in Jonathan's heart. He closed his eyes, trying to suppress his feelings, but the warmth radiating from the woman behind him seeped deep into his bones. Unable to take it, he finally reached out, holding her hand midway. Nancy smiled. "Impressed by my skills?" When he didn't respond, her tone grew uncertain. "Did I do something wrong?" "I'm sorry. I just wanted to help." His heart constricted as he stood up and pulled her into his arms. Hugging her tight, his heart hammered against his ribcage, as if trying to imprint its rhythm on her. He rested his chin on her head and intertwined their fingers before whispering softly, "Maria, how are you so perfect?" He heard her breath hitch and then felt her hug him even tighter. "Because you're so easy to love." A sudden wave of sadness crashed over Jonathan, catching him off guard. Afraid she might notice his turmoil, he released her and quickly retreated to the bathroom. "I'm just going to shower before bed." Nancy winked. "All right. I'll be waiting for you, Mr. CEO." Inside the bathroom, Jonathan didn't even bother undressing before he turned the shower on. The cascading water was his sanctuary, the one place he could shed his restraint and let the sorrow in his heart pour out. With the water streaming down his face, he couldn't tell where the shower ended and his tears began. He was no longer the young boy who'd wept when his father left him, nor the man who bore his family's burdens in silence as his siblings departed. He had learned to show no weakness. But he could never have prepared for how heartbreaking it was to watch death inch closer and closer. The hardest part of all being the thought of saying goodbye to the person he loved the most. Jonathan was unsure how long he'd been under the water when his phone suddenly vibrated on the counter. Seeing it was Dr. Chang, he quickly shut the shower off and answered it. "I have good news and bad news, Jonathan." "Give me the bad first." "We've been working around the clock on the process to synthesize the compound we discovered. We believe it's possible, but not in less than 2 months." Jonathan's heart sank. "Then what's the good news?" "Well, I may have thought up a way to buy us more time. We have a simulator here that's similar to a cryogenic chamber. The technology is new, but it would enable us to cut your metabolic rate in half. In other words, if you're willing to try, this could potentially delay your blood mutation by an additional 2 months." Jonathan took a long beat to digest the news, then gathered his composure. "Are you certain that 2 months isn't long enough?" "As certain as I can be. A process like this would normally take years of full-time research, but given 4 months, there's a sliver of hope." "When should I start?" "Tomorrow. Every second we can buy on this is precious. It might be your only chance at survival." Jonathan nodded and clenched his fist in determination. "Then I'll be there tomorrow morning. Thank you, doctor." When the bathroom door finally creaked open, Nancy gave him a puzzled look. "Why did it take so long to shower? Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine. I just got a call." Jonathan sat down next to Nancy and pulled her close, pausing as he decided how to deliver the news. "Maria, I can't join you on the trip to Houston tomorrow." Nancy blinked in surprise. "Oh, work stuff?" Jonathan nodded. "Mexico. And the explosion knocked out our communication network, so you might not be able to reach me easily." but Jack will be available for anything you might need." He could see the disappointment in her face, but she was as gracious as ever. "No problem. I understand. Besides, Stark's in custody and Amelia's testifying against him. I've handled worse on my own." She pulled away and looked him in the eyes. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Jonathan nodded. "I promise." Nancy seemed to sense that something was off with his mood, so she nestled closer, reaching up to plant a tender kiss on his lips. He stiffened slightly at her touch, then abruptly pulled her closer. His kiss was fiery and passionate, as if he was pouring all of his unspoken emotions into it. Desperate to experience as much of her as he could, he drank in her breath and filled his lungs with her scent. The kiss grew more intense, a hint of pain, but mostly pleasure. She reciprocated, wrapping her arms around his neck and straddling his laugh, surrendering herself to him entirely. Their lust seemed to stretch out endlessly, and when they finally separated, the moon was high in the sky. Jonathan gazed at Nancy, cradling her by his side, as her eyes fluttered closed. He leaned over to plant a gentle kiss on her forehead and whispered in her ear, "I love you, Maria." She opened her eyes for a brief second and met his gaze. "I love you too." Her words echoed around his mind, causing a dull ache in his heart. He tightened his embrace and prayed for time to freeze in that exact moment. He wanted nothing more to live inside that feeling forever. Nancy soon fell asleep, and a bitter sweetness washed over Jonathan. He spent the rest of the night wide awake, watching her sleep until the early morning light slowly filtered in through the window. Knowing he had to leave, and fearing he wouldn't if he stayed until she woke up, he planted one last kiss on her forehead, carefully untangled himself, and climbed out of bed. To his dismay, when he emerged from the bathroom, he found that Nancy perched anxiously on the edge of the bed, her gaze darting around the room. Only when Jonathan appeared did her eyes find a sense of calm. She hopped off the bed and flung herself into his arms. "Why didn't you tell me your flight was so early? I would have woken up to make you breakfast." Jonathan's hand moved soothingly through her hair. "I just wanted you to sleep, but I really do need to go, Maria." She clung to him, refusing to let him go. "I had a nightmare. It scared me to death." "Quickly then, what did you dream about?" "I dreamt that you were gone when I woke up, and you never returned." Nancy nuzzled into Jonathan like a child seeking comfort. "I've always come back before, haven't I?" Nancy nodded. "And I always will." Nancy looked up at him, a smile lighting up her face. "You're right. I'm being silly. Have a safe flight and call me when you can." Jonathan leaned down to kiss her goodbye, and when he pulled away, he locked eyes with her. "Take care of yourself, Maria." "You too, handsome." With that, he collected his luggage, and she followed him to the door, seeing him off with a gentle wave. As he pulled his car out of the garage and started down the street, a tear rolled down his cheek, and he quickly wiped it. As he checked his reflection in the mirror, his heart suddenly clenched as if it might tear into two. Maria was sprinting barefoot down the frozen sidewalk, wearing nothing but her pajamas and a cotton robe. She waved desperately at his car and then reached for a phone that wasn't there. His gaze lingered on her, but he didn't dare stop the car. He refused to let his illness stand in her way, not when her family was burdened with such pain, not when she had waited 3.5 years for justice. He couldn't risk jeopardizing the trial or her ability to be there. She continued running after him as he got further and further away, and seeing her determination brought a fresh round of tears to his eyes. It reminded him of just how strong she really was, and that no matter what she had to face without him, she would be okay. After nearly being struck by oncoming traffic, Nancy finally stopped chasing Jonathan's car. As she gasped for breath on the busy street corner, hot tears streamed down her face, and a sudden, inexplicable sense of desolation washed over her. She wasn't even positive about what had caused her to chase after him in the first place. She just remembered feeling a pang of loneliness that quickly swelled into an overwhelming sense of dread. Passerbys shot judgmental looks at her as she walked back to their apartment building in nothing but pajamas and a robe. But she was lost in a daze. Stepping back into the warmth of the apartment, she was met by Jacob, who rushed over at the sight of her distraught appearance. "Sis, what happened? Why did you go outside like this?" "I don't know. Jonathan left, and I had this feeling like I was never going to see him again." Seeing her swipe helplessly at her phone with numb hands, Jacob guided her to the couch and clasped her hands in his own in order to warm them. "Everything is okay. Just breathe." Her panic gradually settled, and as the feeling returned to her fingers, she gently removed them from Jacob's grasp and flexed her fingers. "Sorry, Jacob. I didn't mean to scare you. With Jonathan going to Mexico and Stark's trial starting today, I think I just had a panic attack." Jacob's eyes narrowed in concern. "You shouldn't have to face Stark alone. I'll go with you." "We can't risk exposing you. You're still the sole inheritor of the Franklin Group, and whoever is behind all of this will be watching the trial as closely as anyone. I'll be fine. I just got overwhelmed." Jacob sighed in reluctant agreement. "Keep your phone on. Update me everywhere you go, and if anything happens, call me right away." Nancy let out a small laugh. "What? You've known Jonathan for 2 months, and you're already turning into him. It's sweet." Jacob blushed and looked away as Nancy got to her feet. "I'm sorry you can't come, but why don't you drive me to the airport?" Jacob nodded, and they headed off to pack her bag. Meanwhile, Jonathan had arrived at Dr. Cheng's clinic, drained from the lack of sleep and roller coaster of emotions. He met Dr. Cheng's solemn gaze and gathered his composure. "Once my metabolic rate is lowered, will I remain conscious? Can I choose to wake up midway?" Dr. Cheng shook his head. "The temperature will put your body into a deep sleep in order to maintain critical body functions. You'll have sensory faculties in theory, but you'll be totally unaware of your surroundings. Medically speaking, the longer you spend inside, the longer we'll have to work on a cure. But that decision will have to be made now." Jonathan nodded. "Let's start with a week, then. I have too many things that I'll need to check in on." "Very well. I'll prepare the chamber, and if you have any last-minute calls to make, I suggest doing it now." Dr. Cheng stepped out, and Jonathan's face darkened. There was one last move he hadn't tried, but given his desperation, it seemed like the time had come. Moving to a quiet corner, Jonathan dialed a number and the line quickly connected. James's fatherly voice coming through. "Jonathan, what can I assist you with, son?" Jonathan gathered his thoughts, and his mouth spread into a knowing smile. "James, I think you can surmise the reason for my call. I'm currently at the Blood Research Institute." James was silent for a moment before responding. "I can't quite grasp your meaning. Do you need my medical advice?" "You know, when I visited your home the other day, I couldn't help but notice the vibrant growth in your garden. It defied everything I thought I understood about life cycles, so I brought back a bit of your soil with me. Can you imagine what they found, Uncle?" James sighed, and his tone was suddenly frank. "I'll admit, I didn't expect you to live long enough to find me out, but you really have always been exceptional. It's just a shame about Kim's health, and such a pity that you refused to marry her." "Your beloved daughter, is she aware of your little scheme? Of all the Davis blood on your hands? Have you considered how she'll react when she discovers the truth?" James let out a hollow chuckle. "I have no intention of telling her. And if I know the gallant Jonathan Davis, you won't tell her either. The shock alone could kill her after all." "Where's the medicine, James?" His laugh deepened. "Surely you're smart enough to know that I wouldn't keep it around just waiting for you to come after it. But I didn't want such a valuable resource to go to waste, so I added it to my garden. I'm glad you enjoyed the results." "So that's it then?" "Sadly for you, yes," James responded coldly. "I'd sooner let it decompose in the earth and serve Kim as a nutrient supplement than let it save your life." He paused before continuing. "You and your family. You act like gods, but you're just devils in disguise. My wife died while treating your mother. Kim was born prematurely and has spent her life on the brink of death. And you thought you could pay that debt with money? Your wife died in a tragic accident, and she would be disgusted if she knew what you've done in her name. My family has spent years trying to make amends for your suffering, and all you've done is use our trust against us. Facts are facts, Jonathan. If it weren't for you, my wife would still be alive, and Kim would be living a long, happy life. Because of you, the Reynolds family will die with me. Why should the same not be true for you? So you're willing to make a compromise, no matter the offer? Don't you dare try to use Kim against me. Unlike you, I actually want what's best for her, so I wouldn't use her well-being as a bargaining chip. This is between you and me. Jameson laughed bitterly. For the love of God, stop it with the noble hero act. His voice grew harsh, each word spat out with vitriol. The medicine is gone. Your family's hope for survival vanished with it. My suggestion, enjoy whatever time you have left. Because one day, poof, you'll all be dead. And one more thing. James trailed off, then suddenly shouted, Kim, hello, darling, and immediately hung up the call. James stared at his daughter in disbelief. She rarely woke up before noon, and he never expected her to be out of bed on her own. But there she was, standing in his doorway, and he had no idea how much she had heard. Her eyes narrowed, and her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her look of shock slowly giving way to disappointment and anger. Is it true? James quickly shook his head, reaching out to support Kim's shoulder. Of course not. It was all a misunderstanding. Just sit down and let me explain. Kim threw his hand away and propped herself up. Don't touch me. I heard every word. What kind of monster are you? Hear me out. I never meant for this to affect you. Kim's voice trembled with emotion. You thought that murdering my closest friend and the only man I've ever loved wasn't going to affect me? Does this mean you're responsible for his brothers as well? James shook his head vehemently. Of course not. This was about you and your mother. About justice. That was an accident, Kim interrupted through her sobs. And I won't stand by while you use me as an excuse for your actions. Mom was a doctor. She saved people. She made people well. I'm glad she's dead, so she can't see what you've become. Just then, Kim seemed to lose balance, and James rushed to her side, supporting her waist and patting her back gently. Easy, Kim. Dad is here. Let's just calm down, okay? Kim tried to pull away, but her strength failed her. She looked up at him with utter disdain and drew a shaky breath. If Jonathan dies, I will too. James felt like a dagger had been rammed into his heart. His voice trembled. Kim, after all the years I've cared for you, he means more to you than your own father? He's a good man. He may have broken my heart, but you tore out my soul. With that, the light in Kim's eyes suddenly went out, and she fainted in James's arms. Laying on her bed and checking her pulse, his anger toward Jonathan surged like a raging inferno. Kim's disappointment and anger had wounded him in a way he might never recover from. And as far as he was concerned, it was just another item on Jonathan's long list of crimes. All he ever wanted was for his daughter to be happy. And when he saw Jonathan with another woman while Kim was gravely ill, it was all he could do not to poison him on the spot. But the details hardly mattered anymore. It hadn't happened as smoothly as James would have liked. But Jonathan was now doomed, just like his brothers. And there were other people out there to take care of Steve. As for the identity of his shadowy benefactor, he never knew or cared. After all, cooperation was about mutual benefit, and as long as his goal was achieved, nothing else mattered to him. After ensuring Kim was in stable condition, James picked up his phone and made one more phone call. When a skeptical voice picked up, James cut him off. Is this Brock Porter? The man on the other end paused. Yes. Who is this? You don't know me, but I have information you might find valuable. Jonathan Davis is terminally ill. He has months to live. And from what I hear, Steve won't be far behind him. On the other end, Brock laughed. And what's that got to do with me? The only thing more painful for Mr. Davis than facing death would be seeing his precious company torn apart right before he dies. With that, James hung up. Nancy managed to keep herself distracted for most of the flight, and when she landed in Houston, she immediately called Esther, who answered with a concerned tone. Hey, how are you holding up? I'm a little rattled, but I'm okay. I'm sorry I can't sit with you in the audience, but as soon as we're done, we'll meet up, okay? Stay strong on the stand, and just remember, we already won. This is our victory lap. When Nancy finally arrived, there was a mass of media and spectators gathered around the courthouse, and she breathed a sigh of relief that as Maria would be able to slip in and out unnoticed. She had imagined countless times what it would feel like to bring her tormentor to justice. But as she stepped through the metal detectors and found her seat in the gallery, she was overcome by a feeling of emptiness. Stark had been caught, but nothing would ever bring her beloved parents back. She sent a quick message to Jonathan to see if he'd made it to Mexico safely, and at precisely 1:30 p.m., the judge gavelled the court to order, and the hearings for the Johnson family murder case commenced. Sitting in the gallery, Nancy was dressed inconspicuously in a simple gray sweater and a lengthy down coat. Since Jonathan had been called to Mexico at the last moment, she brought Zara along for moral support, but kept it hidden in her coat pocket. The defendant's seat remained vacant, but before long, a bailiff appeared, pushing Stark into the room. Nancy's eyes were immediately drawn to him, and it was all she could do not to gasp. His face was shaven, and his clothes were clean, but his complexion was a sickly mix of green and gray, an eerie testament to the damage inflicted on his spirit in the last few weeks. He looked so weak and shriveled that it was hard for Nancy to believe he had ever seemed so terrifying. As his wheelchair turned, Stark and Nancy suddenly locked eyes, and Stark visibly recoiled. It was obvious that the guilt and shame had made him turn away, and Nancy resisted the urge to smirk. She wouldn't be able to take the stand, but she'd be able to torture him in other ways. Once everyone was in place, the presiding judge gavelled the hearing to order, and the prosecutor spoke. Today, the state of Texas will prove beyond a doubt that the defendant, Stark Green, is guilty of first-degree murder in the case of Edward Johnson, Lily Johnson, and Nancy Johnson, as well as the attempted murder of Esther Williams. Nancy's grip on Zara tightened, her fingers trembling as she heard her name read aloud. Following the opening statements, the prosecution called their first and most important witness, Amelia Renner. She emerged from her seat looking frail and unsteady, her pallid complexion and tired eyes a far cry from her once glamorous, model-esque figure. She was quickly sworn in, and the prosecution began their questioning. Miss Renner, were you present when Edward Johnson, Lily Johnson, and Nancy Johnson were murdered? The courtroom fell into a hush, and Nancy saw Stark's hands clench the armrest on his wheelchair, sweat beading onto his furrowed brow. As Amelia took a dramatic pause, a bolt of anxiety shot through Nancy. Jonathan assured her that Amelia would tell the truth, but Nancy had learned to expect the unexpected. Finally, Amelia spoke, her voice a raspy whisper. Yes, I was there. Murmurs erupted around the courtroom until the judge called for quiet and directed the attorney to continue. Miss Renner, did you witness Stark Green murder the 3 victims? And did he remain in your sight the entire time? Amelia nodded. Yes. Please tell the court how he killed each of the 3 victims. Take your time, and be as detailed as possible. Perched on the window stand, Amelia paused to gather her thoughts. Her eyes inevitably drifted over to Stark, and she nearly laughed at the sight of his broken, hunched-over frame. His suffering eased her nerves as she reflected on their torrid romance. Before they met, Amelia was already a famous model, known as much for her stunning figure as her ruthless pursuit of influence. But being a model made it virtually impossible to meet a decent man. And when she was first introduced to Stark, she found herself genuinely moved. He was unlike the men who'd simply kept her around for their pleasure, bringing genuine romance into her life and filling her with hope for what her life might look like after modeling. As her career reached its zenith, national fame no longer felt like enough. Modeling was a young woman's game after all, and Amelia intended to squeeze every drop of juice from it that she could. Seeking international recognition, she persuaded Stark to use his influence at the Franklin Group to pave the way for her. That was when things began to change. Stark soon proposed to Nancy, and in return for his help with Amelia's modeling career, he pressed her to stay by his side as his secret lover, promising her half his fortune when he and Nancy finally got married. She resented the idea of living in the shadows, but the money intrigued her into sticking around. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before Nancy caught Stark and Amelia consummating their affair. Things quickly grew tense between them, and Stark became convinced that Nancy was about to break off their engagement, thus destroying everything they'd worked for. Desperate to maintain his wealth and influence, Stark plotted a nefarious solution: the total eradication of Nancy's family. They started with Nancy, abducting her and locking her up on Stark's yacht while staging her death at sea. They intended to dispose of Nancy quickly, but Amelia and Stark's own relationship had grown fraught, and they soon found themselves taking out their pent-up anger on their prisoner. With their darkest impulses having been unleashed, Amelia and Stark began to delight in finding new ways to torture Nancy. The cycle of violence continued for 3 years before they finally finished the job, and that was when things began to change. Even with Nancy out of the way, Stark still refused to publicly embrace his relationship with Amelia. When she then found him cheating on her the same way he had Nancy, she realized the terrible error she had made. She went on to endure months of his callous behavior and constant infidelities. But when he threatened to kill her, she finally hit her breaking point. Now, with all the skeletons in their closets set to come tumbling out for the vultures to pick at, she found a sick satisfaction in being the person to bring Stark down. He had underestimated her, abused her, and stolen her youth. And now, he was going to pay. With a chilly smile, Amelia turned to the wrapped courtroom. All right, let's begin when I first met Stark. Back in the gallery, Nancy watched with bated breath as Amelia began, a rueful chuckle punctuating her words. I first crossed paths with Mr. Green at an art exhibition. In fact, it was hosted by his foster mother, Lily Johnson. Neither the attorney nor the presiding judge interrupted, allowing Amelia to unfurl their twisted narrative from beginning to end. Gasps and muffled sobs echoed around the room throughout, and from her anonymous place in the middle of it all, Nancy watched with total focus. Each new revelation kindled a raging fire within her, culminating in an overwhelming desire to reduce both of them to ashes. In her recollection, her parents had treated Stark with the same love and kindness as they had her and Jacob. He was never given any less. He was never treated like an outsider, and by all accounts, it had been a warm and loving home. Where was the mistreatment? Where was the alienation that might lead someone to do such horrific things? There was no explanation Nancy could think of, except for Stark's all-encompassing selfishness. At that moment, she suddenly found herself yearning for Jonathan's presence. Having prepared for this moment, she pulled one of his pocket squares out of her bag and held it up to her nose, breathing deeply. Just as she'd hoped, his cool, dry scent lit up her senses and brought her mind back from the edge. She glanced over to the witness box and saw Esther simmering with the same righteous fury. Tears ran down her face, but her fists were both tightly clenched. Amelia's revelations had clearly sparked a fiery rage within her. Still, on the stand, Amelia finally arrived at the point in the narrative where Nancy walked in on her and Stark having sex, the moment that initiated all the violence that was to come. Nancy watched as Stark and Amelia locked eyes. He stared at her with a hatred so visceral it could have torn her apart. But she looked back at him with smug indifference. It was clear that after everything he had put her through, she was savoring the opportunity to take one last swing at him before they both went away forever. Amelia turned her attention back to the prosecutor and continued her testimony in a cool, composed voice. As she began describing every act of brutality they visited upon Nancy over those 3 gut-wrenching years, Nancy suddenly found her body racked by shivers and her eyes spilling over with tears. She feared that the combined intensity of her suffering, her despair, and her white-hot rage might consume her very soul. It was then that she noticed that many of the gathered journalists had simply stopped taking notes, their hands trembling too badly to write. Their pens had once glorified Stark's successes, the biggest of which he had stolen from Nancy herself, and she could only hope that they felt some guilt for playing along in his horrible ruse, for never digging deeper into her and her parents' deaths. When she finally glanced at Stark again, she noticed that his fury had transformed into a stony silence, and that the last bits of color had drained from his face. It was a look of utter defeat, and Nancy knew then and there that she would never forget it. At long last, the time came for the prosecution to play Amelia's video in full. On the courtroom's massive screen, the horrifying moment of Lily's murder played out before a stunned and somber crowd. It was the moment of the trial that Nancy had feared the most, and she quickly found herself holding her breath and gripping Zara tightly. She felt like a fish that had been ripped from the depths of the ocean and was slowly suffocating in a surreal and terrifying new world. Suddenly, Zara flickered to life, and Nancy glanced down to see a message materializing on the screen. It was from Jonathan. "Don't be afraid, Maria. I'm right here. Everything will be fine." A fresh round of tears spilled from Nancy's eyes, and she clutched Zara to her chest as her life depended on it. She had no idea how Jonathan had managed to reach her, but it had somehow come at the perfect moment. When Lily's screams echoed through the courtroom, Nancy squeezed her eyes shut and whispered a prayer. "Rest now, Mother. We finally found peace." With that, Zara's screen faded to black. The first day of the trial ran late into the afternoon and included damning testimonies from Esther, as well as a written statement by Jacob. Stark remained completely silent throughout, and when the prosecution finished with their final witness, the judge called for a recess. Because of the sheer intensity of the testimony, he called for a 2-day break to allow the jurors to recover. As the courtroom emptied out, Nancy felt completely drained. All her deepest wounds had been torn open for the world to see, and she hadn't even been able to speak to them herself. Nonetheless, beneath all the lingering pain and resentment, she felt a terrible weight slowly lifting off her shoulders for the first time in years. Gathering her strength, Nancy rose from her seat and slipped out of the courtroom. Once outside, she climbed to the back of Norman's car, and he drove her to the detention center where Stark was being held during trial. Her knee joggled up and down as she waited to see him, a cruel grin dancing across her face. She had already plunged the knife in. Now she just had to twist it. As Nancy entered the meeting room, she saw Stark sitting hunched over his wheelchair, his head bowed in silence. It was clear that he couldn't bear the thought of looking at her. Taking a deep breath, Nancy sat down across from him and picked up the intercom, her voice cutting through the silence. "Stark, look at me." But all he did was lower his head further. A cold, mocking smile flashed across Nancy's face before she continued. "Fine. If you refuse to speak, I'll leave. But I'll never come back." At the sound of Nancy's threat, Stark's body gave an involuntary shudder, and he slowly lifted his head. His lips trembled slightly, and after a fleeting glance at Nancy, his gaze flitted away. The sight of his discomfort filled Nancy's heart with joy. He may not have a moral compass, but he clearly had shame. He knew what he had done was horrific. He knew he would one day be unable to look the people he cared for in the eyes. And yet, he'd chosen that path anyway. After a moment's silence, Nancy spoke again. "I need to know the truth, Stark. I refuse to believe what I saw in court." Stark's trembling hand finally picked up the intercom, and he looked up at her, his voice strained with regret. "Maria, I'm sorry. I never intended any of this." Nancy shook her head, her eyes wide in feigned disbelief. "This can't be true, right? You can't be the person they say you are." "You have to know that everything we shared was real. I've wanted nothing in my life more than I wanted to leave the country with you and start over." "So you did do it." Stark fell silent again. "But why, Stark? They were so kind to you. Surely what Amelia said wasn't entirely true, was it? Is there something we don't know?" Nancy was here to make him suffer, but she was also here for answers. She wanted to hear from his mouth how he justified what he did. Stark finally caught Nancy's gaze again, and his voice was laced with regret. It hardly matters at this point, but if you want my story, then here it is. Stark took a deep breath, then started at the beginning. The Johnsons didn't know this, but I wasn't an orphan at birth. My father raised me through grade school, and we never had much, but he loved me dearly. Because we were so poor, I got bullied from a young age. And with my dad off working 2, 3, 4 jobs to make ends meet, I was left alone and had to deal with the bullies myself. One day, another kid pushed me down a hill into a cactus patch. My father found me covered in bruises and cuts and burrs, and he felt so bad that he hadn't been there to protect me that he scraped together every penny we had and moved us to Houston to start over. He found a good job, I started at a new school, and for that one brief moment, things finally started to turn up for us. Until 2 months later, when he had a seizure at the dinner table right in front of me. It turned out he had a brain tumor, and he'd been ignoring his symptoms for months because we couldn't afford the medical bills. To get the money for his treatment, I managed to steal a Rolex from a rich kid's dad when he came to pick him up from school. I pawned it myself and paid for the surgery with cash. But then, Stark trailed off, and Nancy's eyes went wide, suddenly putting the pieces together. He died on the operating table, Maria. Just like that. Everything was taken away from me. Stark's chest rose and fell with ragged breaths as he punctuated each phrase. And the surgeon who killed him, who ruined my life, was Edward Johnson. Nancy's breath hitched as the memories came rushing back to her. She remembered a conversation with her father after she failed an exam in college. He'd shared a story of his own greatest failure, his first surgery as an attending physician. As Edward told it, he had assisted on countless similar surgeries as a resident, and by all means, it should have been straightforward. A non-malignant tumor in an easily accessed part of the brain. But as soon as Edward had finished drilling into the man's skull, he suddenly began hemorrhaging blood. In a matter of minutes, the man was dead. As they scrambled to find a reason for what happened, they discovered that the man's blood contained an extremely high level of stimulants. The pre-op examinations should have caught it, and the prep nurse's oversight had resulted in catastrophe. Edward had called it the one true failure of his medical career, not because he'd lost a patient, but because he shouldn't have. Nancy's mind raced as she pieced together Stark's story with her father's confession. But one question nagged at her. Why had Stark's father taken so many stimulants on the day of his surgery? And if they were as poor as Stark suggested, how could they even afford it? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was a larger scheme at play. Some unknown puppet master who engineered Stark's hatred for her father, and then manipulated it into something terrible. It struck Nancy as a tragic irony that all of Stark's vengeance, and all of his cruelty, was being orchestrated by his real enemy. Deranged by hatred, he had allowed himself to become a mere weapon in someone else's war. Nancy's eyes welled up in tears, her heart aching at the unveiled truth. When Stark finally spoke again, his voice was filled with unspeakable sorrow. I was blind with hatred, Maria. It warped my entire world. My father, he was everything to me. Nancy shook her head. But how can you really know it was his fault? And even if it was, his wife and daughter were innocent. Why hurt them too? You and Nancy grew up together, for God's sake. She saw you as her brother. She even agreed to marry you. How could you treat her that way? How could you be so blind to her suffering? A tear rolled down Stark's cheek. You're right, Maria. Nancy was always kind to me. The very thing that soured our bond was the engagement. It was clear she never truly loved me, and her rejection inflamed all my deepest fears. She was the golden child, and I was the poor orphan boy she allowed to ride her coattails out of pity, after her own father had stolen my only chance at a normal life. He paused, his fingers nervously fiddling as he struggled to find the words. I was wrong, Maria. I see that. Can you forgive me? You should be asking Nancy that, not me. But I don't think she'd ever forgive you. I know I've let you down, But you have to believe me. I love you. I've never known what true love feels like until now." Nancy's eyes narrowed, a cynical smile tugging at her lips. Was it that easy to drop a knife and become a saint? Could a person like Stark really change? What then of justice? Her expression hardened, her once clear eyes clouding over with disgust. "I used to think you were different, Stark. You respected me, gave me opportunities, and never rushed things. I thought you were a good person, but I see now that it was just a carefully crafted facade. When you got tired of me, you would have thrown my body on the pile with all the others, wouldn't you?" "No! Maria, please!" She slowly pulled the intercom away from her ear. "Goodbye, Stark." She tossed away the earpiece, covered her face, and turned to flee. As she burst out of the room, she heard him yelling after her. "Maria, don't go! Don't give up on us! You're all I have!" Stark's heart pounded in his chest. As he watched her leave, he attempted to stand, but his legs immediately gave out, and he tumbled out of the wheelchair, cracking his teeth on the cold, hard floor. The pain in his mouth was searing, but it paled in comparison to the one in his heart. She was his only reason to live, and she had given up on him. He truly had nothing left. With great effort, Stark hoisted himself from the ground. He gazed down at his crippled legs and was filled with disgust for his own pathetic condition. Less than a month earlier, he had been the powerful CEO of the Franklin Group and the beloved son-in-law of the famous Johnson family. Now, he'd been nothing but a broken, hopeless prisoner until the day he died. The realization shrouded him in an icy dread, stifling his breath and shaking his soul. In a matter of weeks, he felt as if he'd aged 50 years. Confined to his cell until his next hearing, Stark lost his appetite and drifted in and out of lucidity. His life had been reduced to a hollow shell, and thoughts of ending it altogether were thwarted by his physical weakness. He rested his tongue against his teeth, tasting a hint of blood as he slumped against the wall, whispering to no one. "Don't give up on me, Maria. Don't give up on me." Meanwhile, Nancy had shaken off her conversation with Stark and was making her way to a prearranged dinner with Esther. When Nancy entered their private room, Esther rushed over and enfolded her in a tight hug. Her eyes were swollen from all the tears she'd shed, and her voice was a ragged whisper. "All those horrible things they did to you! I had no idea." "It doesn't hurt anymore, Esther. I promise." "No! A trial was too good for them, Nancy. I want to tear them apart and feed them to the dogs." Nancy held her close. "It's okay. It's over. They can't hurt us anymore." Tears flowed freely as they both clung to each other, but before long, their shared misery morphed into a delirious joy of victory against all odds. With Jonathan's people keeping a watchful eye on them, they allowed themselves to let loose. After barely touching their food, they started to drink. Finding the two most expensive bottles of champagne in the restaurant, they shook them up and popped the corks, spraying foam all over. They toasted, sipped, and toasted again, growing dizzier with each passing moment. With their ragged emotions fueled by the alcohol, they laughed and cried until they were too drained to even stand. Just then, the door opened and Norman approached Nancy. "Come with me, Maria. I'll escort you back to your hotel." Nancy snorted dismissively, her words slurring as she weakly pushed Norman aside. "I don't want you. I want Jonathan, or nothing at all." Norman faltered, then stepped over to Esther. "Miss Williams, could you—" But before he could finish the sentence, Esther threw herself into his arms, tracing his chest muscles with her fingertip. "If she doesn't want you, maybe I'll just take you home." Norman blushed and tried to push Esther away. "I have instructions to personally take Maria home. I'll have someone else escort you." Esther interrupted him by putting a finger to his lips. "Shh! No talking, muscle man." Then she reached out again, feeling Norman's arms and shoulders. "My God, you're jacked. What's your name? Where do you live? Are you married?" "Don't worry, it's not a deal breaker." As Norman stammered in disbelief, he noticed that Nancy had fallen asleep in her chair, spilling a glass of champagne onto the floor. He tried to disentangle himself from Esther's grip, but she had one arm looped around his neck, and the other one was drifting down to his midsection. With tipsy seriousness, she mused aloud. Hold still. I need to count. How many abs are there? Norman suddenly stiffened from the unexpected contact, but before he could stop her from going further, an unexpected voice echoed from the doorway. Esther, stop that right now. Norman turns toward the voice, and there stood Xavier, who closed the distance between them with swift strides. Esther, you're making a fool of yourself. Let him go and I'll take you home. He was used to getting a reaction from her, even if it was negative, but this time she simply ignored him. Her gentle smile remained as she continued her playful teasing of Norman. Whatever lady locks this down is a lucky woman. Oof, you should try to bench press me. Clocking Norman's discomfort, Xavier pulled Esther away, but she immediately spun around and swatted at him. Hey, I was having fun. Who invited you anyway? Xavier's jaw clenched, and without a word, he scooped her up and strode out. Esther floundered momentarily, but quickly began swatting at him again. Her thick winter coat made it hard for her to move around, but it only served to exacerbate Xavier's frustration. Dodging her strikes, he walked up to his car, deposited her in the back seat, and strapped her in. As he drove her back to her hotel, Xavier chastised himself for bothering to show up in Houston in the first place. She had blocked his number after the last time they spoke, and though he had tried reaching out to her through other means, he hit the cold wall of silence at every turn. He initially assumed it was part of the same cat-and-mouse game they had been playing since the day they met, but more and more, he was becoming convinced that her interest in him had in fact faded to nothing. He couldn't deny his feelings for her, but his dignity could only take so many direct hits. He felt he had done his best to put himself out there like she asked, to show how he truly felt, but in return, he received only indifference and defiance. Her unpredictable swings between warmth and coldness had him feeling like a puppet at her mercy. But just as he was becoming to terms with losing her forever, news of the Johnsons' murder case surfaced. Images from the courtroom had been leaked, including one of Esther giving her tearful testimony. The sight of her in such deep pain stirred something in Xavier, and without a second thought, he booked the next flight to Houston. As soon as he landed, he called Norman to find out where Esther and Maria were having dinner. As he drove to meet them, he imagined all the things he might say. He hoped that his gesture of concern would finally convince her of his true feelings, and that perhaps something good could come from all the pain. That the two of them could truly connect for the first time. And then he saw her with Norman. A volcano of jealousy, regret, and embarrassment erupted in his mind. He knew he had no place to be mad at her, but knowing that she was partying and flirting with other men, when he had been thinking only of her, made him feel lower than dirt. As the world outside the car flew by, neither of them spoke. But despite Xavier's turmoil, he couldn't help stealing glances in the rearview mirror. When they finally arrived at the hotel, Xavier tossed his keys to the valet, then went around to the back seat and picked Esther up. As he charged through the lobby, she began protesting again. Stop it! Put me down! You can't even stand up straight. What are you going to do? Crawl through the hotel? Maybe I will. You are, without a doubt, the most infuriating person I've ever met. Takes one to know one. When they finally made it to the elevator and began their ascent, Xavier leaned his head back against the wall and exhaled in frustration. As he attempted to calm his nerves, he felt Esther's hand caressing his chest, and he looked down at her with a furrowed brow. What are you doing? She ignored his question. Not bad, all things considered. But you're no Norman. Oh my God. Seriously, you should give him a good squeeze sometime. He's like an action hero. Xavier's voice hardened into a growl. Stop it, Esther. I'm serious. It's not an insult. Not everyone can have a body that chiseled. If they did, it wouldn't be special anymore. Xavier's temper was on the verge of snapping. It took all of his self-control not to drop her on the floor and walk away. When he finally made it to her room, He flung the door open and practically tossed her onto the bed. Jeez, someone is feeling sensitive. Esther, be silent, Xavier growled through clenched teeth. His tone was so sharp that it finally seemed to get her attention. She sat up on the bed and looked down at him dubiously. Wait, didn't I tell you to stop contacting me? What are you even doing here? Her words slashed through him like a knife. He never felt so demeaned and exposed. And he'd walked into the trap on his own 2 feet. His chest heaved and his eyes burned with anger. I must be an absolute fool to see you crying on the news and rush to your side. With that, he yanked off his tie in frustration and hurled it into the trash. Then he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. But just as he stepped through the doorway, he heard Esther scream and spun around to see her tumble off the bed and smash into the nightstand before hitting the ground with a thud. A gasp of pain escaped her lips, and the pathetic sound halted Xavier in his tracks. He rolled his eyes at himself and then rushed back in to check on her. She was sprawled out on the floor, her hair was tossed over the plush carpet, and one leg akimbo on the bedside table, with the other folded underneath her. Her face was flushed red, and if she hadn't been groaning in pain, it would all have struck him as comical. Seeing her in such a helpless state for the first time, he found his anger suddenly ebbing and being replaced by a reluctant amusement. He crouched beside her and narrowed his eyes. What's all of this? Are you trying out for the circus now? Esther's eyes opened, and her gaze met his eyes as a woozy smile crossed her lips. If you thought that was good, you should see me on the trapeze. Xavier let out a laugh despite himself, and after a few seconds of staring at her, he hoisted her back on the bed and scanned her for any signs of injury. What hurts? Where did you hit? Esther pointed to a swelling red spot on her forehead, and Xavier grimaced. Well, maybe that'll sober you up. Esther pushed him away and staggered to her feet, looking around the room. I need water. Xavier watched in silence, waiting to see if she would ever ask for help. But as usual, she insisted on doing it herself. She stumbled towards the minibar, knocking a lamp over in the process, and Xavier shook his head in disbelief. Even at her most defenseless, she refused to let him in, refused to admit any weakness. Finally reaching the minibar, Esther unscrewed a bottle of water and gulped it down, leaning back against the door for support. With his anger once again surging, Xavier stood up from the bed and walked to the door. Move aside, Esther. She narrowed her eyes at him, and his tone grew harsher. I said get out of the way. Esther grunted and shifted to the side. But before he could even get the door open, her knees seemed to give out, and she tumbled toward him, throwing water all over his shirt and pants. He instinctively caught her, and before he knew it, she had her arm looped around his neck, her warm breath fanning his chest. Nestling into him, her voice dropped to an endearing whisper. Has anyone ever told you you make an excellent pillow? Xavier swallowed hard, his heart pounding as he struggled to parse his own feelings. But he was determined not to let her embarrass him again, so he braced a hand on her waist and put the other on the doorknob. Esther, let's go. She shushed him impatiently and pressed her body closer to him, her nose grazing against his throat, and her tantalizing scent filling his nostrils. Before he could respond, she pressed a soft kiss to his neck, and a fire ignited within him. A sudden rush of desire caught Xavier off guard. His blood jumped, and his breath hitched. What are you doing, Esther? She shot him a disgruntled look. Quit the drama, Xavier. His grip on the doorknob loosened at the sound of her saying his name, and he took a moment to gauge her intentions. Do you realize how dangerous it is to be this drunk in public? More lectures? Really? I had the most draining day of my life, and I got drunk in private with my best friend while our personal bodyguards watched over us. You're just mad you weren't invited. The desire in Xavier's heart clashed with the anger in his gut. How could she kiss him so seductively and then immediately turn around and insult him? Attempting to shake it off, he scooped her up in his arms and swiftly made his way back inside. I must have really owed you in the past life for all the crap you make me put up with. He gently placed her back on the bed and attempted to stand back up when a sharp tug stopped him. Ouch! Esther cried out, and Xavier glanced down to see a curl of Esther's hair caught in his shirt button. Bending back over, he gingerly tried to disentangle her hair, but the darkness in the room and his wet shirt only made the task more difficult. Underneath him, Esther shifted. If you wanted to pull my hair, you could have just asked. She winked at him, and he looked away. He was acutely aware of their proximity, and his frustration mounted as the knot in her hair only seemed to grow tighter. To get more leverage, Xavier's body pressed closer to hers, reducing the distance between them to virtually nothing. Seriously? This is your dumb way of getting me into bed? Xavier's voice came back in a low growl, laced with exasperation. What do you suggest? Your hair is like a shaggy dog's. He applied a little force, and Esther yelped. Why don't you just take your shirt off? I can get it. Is this because I said Norman was stronger than you? It's literally his job to be strong. You have to get more confidence, man. Fine. Just shut up about Norman. Xavier adjusted his position, propping himself up on his elbow and undoing his shirt buttons from the top. When he finally managed to free her hair, he inadvertently tugged on it and pulled her body upright against his. Exhaling in relief, Xavier was just about to climb off of her when Esther's hand suddenly found his bare chest. Her skin was pale and soft, a stark contrast against his tanned, muscular chest. She ran her hand over it and hummed in approval. See? Much nicer than that wet shirt of yours. Xavier was at a loss for words, desperately trying to sort between his competing impulses. But as his gaze trailed from the hand on his chest up to her beautiful face, he knew he could never resist her. His focus lingered on her tantalizing lips, and he swallowed hard. When he finally met her gaze, she moved her hand and sighed. Too bad you were just leaving. Catch you around, I guess. But before she could complete her sentence, her words were swallowed by a sudden, passionate kiss. Xavier captured her wandering hands and pinned them above her head as he pressed his full weight onto her. She exhaled sharply, and his mind swirled with a singular thought. Taking the power back. The next morning, Esther woke up sore and disoriented. Her eyes were still puffy with sleep. She stretched lazily and massaged her pounding temples before finally forcing her eyelids to flutter open. Her brain was foggy with the remnants of her hangover until she felt a constriction around her, a strong arm holding her captive. The sudden realization sobered her instantly, and she jolted back, her forehead colliding with Xavier's chin. Xavier grunted awake as Esther stared at him, wide-eyed. As if a dam had suddenly opened, the events of the previous night came flooding back to her. The trial, the dinner, Norman, Xavier. She blushed at the memory of how reckless she'd been. Now, here they were, their naked bodies wrapped tightly around one another. A tense silence filled the room before Xavier finally broke it, gazing at her tenderly. Good morning, Esther. The sound of her name on his tongue made her heart pound. She had a hunch that he had feelings for her, but he was looking at her like he was in love with her. Suddenly feeling trapped, she wriggled out of his grip and spun out of bed. Good morning? What's good about it? My searing headache or the clingy man-child in my bed? Aha, you didn't seem to think that I was a man-child last night. Well, alcohol is exactly notorious for fueling good decision-making. The implication hung heavy in the air, and Xavier sat up on his elbows. What's that supposed to mean? Come on, Xavier. Us? This? It's a mess, and you know it. Xavier's gaze grew frosty. So last night meant nothing to you? Xavier's mind raced. As much as she hated feeling possessed, she couldn't deny that she enjoyed the night before. It was a side of Xavier that she never had been able to unlock before. Nonetheless, he still struck her as tempestuous and unpredictable. If she led him on, it would easily backfire. Scrambling for a way out, she opted for the casual derision that had always set him off in the past. Biting her knuckle in feigned guilt, she took on a condescending tone. Oh, honey, innocent baby boy. We didn't make love last night. We had sex. Of course it didn't mean anything. But I'm sorry you got the wrong impression." Xavier sprung to his feet and closed the distance between them in seconds. He glared down at her, scrutinizing her smug grin. "You're lying. You're lying like you always do, because you refuse to let anyone get close to you." "No, no. I refuse to let you get close to me. You can accept that." Esther bent down to gather her clothes, but as she started putting them on, she noticed Xavier's gaze fixated on the sheets. Esther followed her eyes, and her heart quickened. There was a small spot of blood. Xavier turned back to her. "Was last night your first?" Esther scoffed. "No! I'm nearly 30 years old, for God's sake. Sometimes that just happens." She noticed Xavier flinch at her response, and her eyes suddenly went wide with realization. "Oh my God! It was yours, wasn't it?" Xavier blushed, and Esther groaned. "So that's why you're being so weird." He turned back at her with a stormy glare. "I'm so sorry I decided to wait for someone special instead of handing it out like Halloween candy." "Which is it then? Am I someone special or am I a slut?" Seemingly at a loss for words, Xavier looked away, nostrils flaring. Esther shook her head in disbelief. "You think you're different, Xavier, but you're not. I could swap you out with any other man, and it would be exactly the same. You're all just jealous hypocrites." He whipped his head around to face her again, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Sorry for touching you last night. Don't worry, I won't tell." With that, she turned and made her way to the bathroom. Stepping toward the mirror, she saw Xavier in the reflection behind her, clenching a pillow in his fist. Suddenly, before she could react, he had thrown the pillow down and stormed up behind her. "If it matters so little to you, then why don't we do it again right now?" Without waiting for her response, he spun her around and kissed her. By the time they were done, they were panting for breath, and both of their legs were weak. Esther slid down the wall and let the water from the shower cascade over her, rinsing away the sweat. She inhaled deeply and watched as Xavier quickly got dressed, leaving her hotel room without so much as another glance. Once he got into the elevator, Xavier pulled the stop button and leaned back, staring at himself in the mirror on the opposite wall. His emotions were a whirlwind as Esther's words echoed in his mind. Was he really so replaceable to her? The idea clawed at his heart, his body tingling with satisfaction, while his heart teetered on the brink of madness. In a way, she was right. He was jealous of every man she spoke to, every man she flirted with. He wanted her all to himself, to possess her entirely. And her rejection only made him want her more. The fury inside him suddenly became blinding, and he hurled a punch at the elevator wall, leaving a clear indent of his hand in the metal. His knuckles immediately split open, and pain lit up his body. But it also gave him a perverse form of relief. When Esther emerged from the shower, she discovered she had a number of missed calls from her mom and Nancy. Dialing her mom first, she immediately heard a relieved voice come through the line. "Esther, thank God! We were worried sick." "Sorry, Mom. It was a long day and we had a little too much to drink. I stayed in a hotel so I didn't have to get a ride home." "Just let us know next time. After everything that's happened, we can't bear the thought of losing you again." "I will, Mom. I'll be home soon, okay?" After ending the call with her mom, she dashed off a text to Nancy to let her know she was okay. And then she pulled herself together and left the hotel. After reading Esther's message, Nancy opened her text thread with Jonathan and stared at the 4 messages she'd sent him the night before, all undelivered. She sighed and quickly typed out another one. "Nothing to do today, so call any time if you see this. Miss you, my prince." She waited long enough to see that the message once again didn't deliver, and then set her phone down with a huff. It was ridiculous, really. They had only been apart for a mere 2 days, but she found herself yearning for him almost constantly. His soothing voice, his protective embrace, the pouty face he made when she ribbed him about something. 6 months earlier, she was convinced she would never trust another person again, certainly not enough to be in a relationship. And now here she was, practically married and lovesick like a teenager. She couldn't believe how much she had come to depend on another person. But even more than that, she couldn't believe that she didn't mind it. She absentmindedly browsed for flights to Mexico before deciding Jonathan would be furious if she showed up unannounced. Then ordered room service and watched TV until she fell asleep. After all, Stark was to be sentenced the following day, and she knew she'd have to have her wits about her. She arrived at the courthouse at 9 the following morning, and the mood was noticeably more somber than the first hearing 2 days earlier. Few people in the gallery spoke, as the assembled crowd waited for the judge to gavel the hearing to order, and a profound sense of finality settled in over the room. Before long, the bailiff pushed Stark into his wheelchair, and Nancy gasped at the sight of him. It looked like he had aged 10 years in 2 days. His vitality was completely drained, and his eyes were clouded over with gloom. Taking his place, he glanced around the room, clearly looking for her. When their eyes finally met, his face lit up with a glimmer of hope. Unlike their last meeting, his gaze lingered on her throughout, as if seeking comfort. Nancy's face remained totally neutral, but she could tell at that moment that she had become his last remaining source of light. She struggled not to smirk, as she imagined what his reaction would be when she finally revealed her true identity, and snuffed that light out for good. She had all the power now, and it felt incredible. The court soon came to order, and the judge asked the lead juror to rise and present their findings. To no one's surprise, the jury delivered unanimous guilty verdicts on all counts, and everyone in the room cheered loudly. Nancy noticed Amelia crying, but Stark looked as if he wasn't even listening. He was just staring at her with the same soft smile. The judge finally got the gallery to settle down, and after a brief pause, prepared to deliver their sentences. It was the moment Nancy had been waiting for, and she clutched Zara to her chest with all her might. In all my time on the bench, I have never witnessed a crime with such gratuitous and wanton brutality. In my estimation, you're malignant tumors in our great society, and the worst of what the human race has to offer. Your lack of empathy, humanity, and compassion should terrify us all, and your comeuppance ought to be cause for celebration. It certainly will be for me. Stark Green, it is with solemn pride that I assure everyone in this room you will never take another breath of free air. This court hereby sentences you to life in prison without parole. Amelia Renner, despite your voluntary testimony, your willful participation in the horrific acts borne out by Mr. Green leaves me no choice but to view you with the same contempt. But as I am constrained by the law rather than my conscience, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years served. He slammed the gavel down, and a single tear trickled down Nancy's cheek. Case closed, and may God have mercy on your souls. The words of the judge echoed in Nancy's mind, ringing as clear as a cathedral bell. After 2 lifetimes of heartache and despair, justice had finally been served. The spirits of her departed family, whose cries had fallen on deaf ears so long ago, could now rest peacefully. From the plaintiff's seat, Esther rose and extended her hand as she was enveloped in a comforting embrace by their parents. Nancy yearned to join her, but it was more important for her to maintain a low profile. As the room filled with reporters, their flashbulbs fired relentlessly, each burst of light capturing a fleeting moment of joy or sorrow. Stark, now cuffed and bound, was escorted away to face his life sentence. His future was to be confined within the 4 walls of a prison cell, and his only company would be solitude and regret. As he was led away, his gaze remained locked onto Maria, filled with a silent plea to not forget him. If he knew she thought of him from time to time, he might just be able to go on living. When he arrived at prison, Stark was shown to his new quarters, a compact cell that could be his home for the foreseeable future. He clutched the cold metal bars holding him in, and his voice rang out with hoarse desperation. Please, I just want to see the person I love one more time. The warden chuckled, and approached him with a grin smirk. Did you miss the part where you lost the right to ask for things? If you have a visitor, we'll let you know. Otherwise, you can write letters and make one phone call per week. But I have to see her. The warden rolled his eyes. Here's the deal. Take it or leave it. As a housewarming gift, I'll call your little girlfriend and let her know where you are. But the next time you shout at me... The warden whipped out his nightstick and ran it along the bars. Let's just say it's not going to feel good. Stark stepped back from the bars and nodded. Good. Get comfortable. You're going to be here for a while. With that, the warden let out a booming laugh and walked off. The wait was agonizing. He was unsure if she would agree to him, but his desperation to speak to her, to admit his mistakes and seek forgiveness, was overpowering. His torment was finally interrupted when the warden passed by again. Tough luck, son. Maria doesn't want to see you. But to be fair, I wouldn't either. You're an ugly son of a gun. You know that? Anyway, happy housewarming. Stark recoiled, collapsing to the floor. He buried his face in his hands, and a guttural groan escaped his lips. She despised him. He had nothing left. Flashes of their shared past haunted him, her slender neck dripping blood under his henchman's knife, her terrified cries. He had wronged her, and this was his karmic retribution. She was goodness reincarnated, and he was tainted, a monstrous creature of darkness and violence. Slumped in his wheelchair, he stared into the dark void of his new reality. A lifetime encased within the cold, unyielding walls of gray, a world without Maria. After hanging up with the warden, Nancy leaned back in the courthouse hallway and smiled at the idea of Stark steeping in his despair. She'd used Jonathan contacts to keep tabs on him in prison, and just when he was teetering on the edge of hopelessness, she'd appear, give him a momentary glimpse of hope, and then deliver the final blow. Her mind whirled with calculations, and she decided to extend her stay in Houston by a day to fetch her mother's watch and wrap up some loose ends. But just as she pulled her phone out to text Esther, she was stopped cold by the sound of a conversation around the corner. The gravelly tone of a male voice snaked its way into her ears. Are you kidding me? The boss was never going to help Stark. His collateral damage was exactly what made him such a perfect pawn. Same with his low-life father. Nancy's breath hitched. The goosebumps erupted on her skin. Pawn? Stark? Could she really have stumbled across the people plotting against her and Jonathan's families? Despite the danger, she refused to miss an opportunity to ID them. She switched her phone to silent mode, and holding her breath, she edged closer and closer to the corner. Finally peering around it, she caught a glimpse of the man's clothing. He appeared to be tall and sturdy, but his age was a mystery. Suddenly, he lowered his hand where Nancy could see it, and she spotted a black eagle tattoo on his right wrist. Slowly, with the caution of a thief, Nancy activated her phone's camera to get a picture. But just as she was about to take it, the man spun around. Hey, there's someone listening. Adrenaline surged through Nancy's veins. She pivoted on her heel and sprinted down the staircase with her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The thunderous footsteps of her pursuers echoed in her ears, and they shouted to each other with urgency. There are no security cameras in the stairwell. You get your hands on him and break his neck. Fear rocketed Nancy's heart into her throat. She ran as if her life depended on it, and a voice in her head urged her on. No matter what, she couldn't allow herself to be captured. Jonathan was waiting for her. Emerging from the corridor into the sun, her eyes darted frantically about. Before her, a bare road stretched out with no place to hide. With only seconds to spare, Nancy suddenly spotted an open sewer entrance. It was a leap of faith, but Nancy knew the alternative was certain death. With that, she plunged into the sewer. As the two men burst through the door to the stairwell, they were met with an empty lot next to the courthouse. They looked at each other in confusion. Where the hell did he go? He couldn't have gone too far, could he? Just as they were about to split off and search the rest of the building, one of them spotted the sewer cap. In Nancy's rush, she failed to close it all the way. Meanwhile, in the labyrinth depths of the sewer, Nancy was on the move, crawling through a maze of pipelines, all of her senses on high alert. A shallow stream of water ran underfoot, but Nancy had no idea when it might turn into a raging torrent. As she wound through channel after channel, she found herself forced to squeeze through minuscule openings, pressing herself flat against the cold, wet metal, and tearing her clothes on the jagged edges. Each meter gained gave her a fraction of hope, but she was acutely aware of the ruthless determination of the men who had spotted her. Her greatest source of optimism was they apparently hadn't got a good look at her to realize she wasn't a man. She pressed relentlessly until she finally emerged into a wider section of the sewer, where she faced a branching pathway. She initially saw it as a statistical advantage that would make her harder to find, but she quickly stumbled upon a dozen forks before running headlong into a roaring waterway. With no clear path forward and her heart and lungs burning, she paused to catch her breath. Suddenly remembering her phone, she dug into her bag, but found nothing besides Zara and a few pieces of candy. She had clearly dropped it somewhere in the sewer. Her mind raced as she tried to form a plan. She knew it was unlikely that the men would find her quickly, but she also had no clue where to find an escape route without backtracking. That's when she remembered Zara. Digging it out of her bag, she said a silent prayer that it hadn't been damaged in the chase, and powered it on. To her relief, it promptly sprang to life. She first asked to call Norman, but it responded that there were no available communication signals. Thinking fast, Nancy initiated its map feature and instructed it to chart the tunnels and compare the data against the map of Houston that it had saved internally. Sooner or later, it would be able to locate her position and direct her to a way out. As she trudged through the sewer, hunger began to gnaw at her stomach, and she ate one of the 2 chocolates she'd had floating around in her bag. It was hardly nourishing, but she had no idea how long she'd have to survive before her next meal. As the day turned to night, and Nancy continued plodding the sewers, she found herself wondering about Norman. She had no idea how she'd lost him in the first place, but he would undoubtedly be looking for her. All she could hope for was that whenever her phone lost signal, it had indicated she was underground. The temperature soon dropped, and her sodden feet turned numb from the cold. But the thought of Jonathan, Jacob, and Esther gave her the will to push forward. Finally, at 4 a.m., Zara sprang to life. Map analysis complete. Exit located. Nancy felt a surge of relief and pulled up the complicated map on Zara's tiny screen. Her hunger and exhaustion suddenly seemed to disappear, and tears of joy spilled from her eyes as she set off toward the escape point. After an hour, Nancy began to recognize the junctures she was passing and realized that Zara was leading her back to the spot where she'd initially entered the sewer. She feared the possibility of running into her pursuers, but also knew she had to get out of the elements soon, or she risked freezing to death. She slowed her pace to listen for any sign of a search party, and when she reached the familiar, narrow section of the sewer, she suddenly heard a snoring sound and froze in place. Ducking out of view, Nancy muted Zara and extended it cautiously through the narrow crack to scan the area. When she pulled it back and examined the results, her heart dropped. There were 3 men waiting, and none of them were Norman. A wave of dread washed over her, and she flattened herself against the wall, battling the surge of despair that was rising within her. From the other side, the snoring grew louder. The voices began to filter through. The hushed conversation echoed eerily in the tunnel. "Damn, where the hell did that kid go? You think he died in here?" The sound woke up the snoring man, and he scoffed in disbelief. "Wait, he seriously still hasn't come out?" "No, you lazy idiot. But the boss checked the sewer maps, and this zone is a total maze. This is the only exit for miles, so our orders are to stay here until he shows up, or it's been long enough for him to starve to death. Let's hope it's the former. But he's toast either way." Nancy's heart skipped a beat at the sound of the man's words. She was barely hanging on as it was, and it had been less than 24 hours. If they were truly committed to waiting her out, then she had no other cards to play. Tell the boss I found the kid's phone and tossed it into some lady's shopping bag. Wish I could see the looks on their faces when they track it down. Their crude laughter filled the cavernous space, and Nancy's heart sunk further. Did you see the men they had swarming the courthouse, though? Whoever we caught, he's clearly a big fish. Big fish or not, it won't matter when he's dead. It was then that the fourth man arrived, carrying what sounded like shopping bags. The men all cheered, and Nancy heard the clinking of bottles before the savory aroma of roasted chicken wafted into her hiding place. Her stomach growled so loudly that she worried they might hear it, and she quickly distanced herself, retreating further into the darkness. Hunger gnawed at her, and fatigue made her legs tremble. The cold seemed to cut through her, so she squatted down, rubbing her hands together in a vain attempt to create warmth. She was desperate to rest, but feared the cold would claim her if she fell asleep. With the last of her energy, she reached up and tied her hair around an overhead pipe, a makeshift alarm. If she nodded off and her head dropped, the pull of her hair would wake her up. The voices of her pursuers faded into the distance, and in the pitch-black sewer, time gradually seemed to lose its meaning. In the face of despair, she clung to Jonathan's words from the day before. Don't be afraid, Maria. I'm right here. Everything will be fine. She knew Zara had no signal and was running low on battery, but she pulled it up and typed out a message to Aries anyway. Jonathan, what do you do when you feel like giving up? I think about all the moments we've shared, and your warmth feels impossibly out of reach in this God-forsaken sewer. I'm so hungry and so cold. She paused, then let out a deep sigh and continued. I miss you so much, my love. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Zora's battery is running low, and I don't see a way out. But if I somehow make it out of this, I want to marry you as soon as possible. With that, she quickly sent the message and turned off Zara. As the darkness seemed to swallow her whole, her body went numb, and her mind grew hazy. She teetered on the edge of consciousness, but just as her mind went blank, she thought she saw something shimmering in front of her. A brief beacon of hope amidst the doom. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Jonathan lay peacefully in the cryo chamber. His face was serene, and his brainwaves showed only the faintest hint of activity. A machine by his side meticulously recorded his physiological data, providing him with essential nutrients and tracking his metabolism. Directly next, Aries maintained a silent vigil. All through the night and the following day, Norman mounted a scorched earth search for Maria. He thought his phone might burst into flames from the constant use, but each call brought nothing but disappointment. After 30 hours with no sleep, he turned Houston upside down and hadn't found a single shred of evidence pointing to Maria's location. He'd found her cell phone in an old lady's shopping bag, and security footage never showed her exiting the courthouse. As he looked back over his search grid, he was left with only one chilling conclusion. Maria was in the hands of their adversaries, and by now, they could have taken her anywhere. Just then, his phone rang. It was Jack, his voice strained with worry. Norman, any news of Maria? Nothing. It's like she disappeared off the face of the earth. Has anyone tried to contact Jonathan about a ransom? Radio silence. Where could she be? Norman's mind raced with anxiety. Jonathan was out cold, and he'd entrusted her safety to them. If anything happened to her. Just then, Jack cut in. I'll check the wires and reach out to all my intermediaries again. You get in touch with Steve and see if he can help. Maybe that robot of his can get a beat on hers. A few hours later, Nancy jolted awake in the frigid sewer tunnel, her head throbbing from her hair being pulled. Her lips were parched and cracked, and her entire body tingled with numbness. It took every ounce of her strength to make even the slightest movement, but after 5 minutes of agony, she managed to get to her feet. Leaning against the wall, she inched back toward the exit to listen in on her captors, who were yet again killing time with booze and food. It occurred to her that if they got drunk enough, she might be able to sneak past them. But if she could barely find the energy to stand, there's no way she'd be able to make a break for it. As she listened to their idle chatter and bided her time, she was suddenly reminded of a night years earlier, when she and Eduardo pulled an all-nighter working on a project. The thought of their delirious jokes after 36 hours of work warmed her heart. And she knew if she could endure that, she could multiply that endurance by 3. Gritting her teeth, Nancy vowed to hold on. Thousands of miles away, in New York City, Brock was jolted from his planning by a call from Austin. I did some digging. Looks like no one has seen Jonathan in days. So that crazy old man might have been telling the truth. Brock's eyes narrowed, a wave of confusion washing over him. It's hard to believe. He always seemed like the picture of health. Pictures don't tell the whole story, I guess. It looks like he went to the Blood Research Institute a few days ago and never came out. Plus, there's been a major uptick in security. Makes sense. He'd be at his most vulnerable while receiving treatment, and they wouldn't want it to leak. So, what's the play? Do we make our move now, or run it up the chain? You have to learn to think a few steps ahead, Austin. If Jonathan is really on his deathbed, do we really want to be the ones hastening the inevitable? After all, we don't know how high up this whole thing goes. Just keep your cool. If he only has a few days left, then this little pet project will fall into our lap soon enough. For now, we watch and wait. Just then, the door to Brock's office abruptly swung open. Hannah stood in the doorway, staring at him in disbelief, her voice shaking. Brock, are you seriously planning on exploiting Jonathan? He quickly ended his call with Austin, then turned to Hannah. Business is business. If I don't do it, someone else will. Is he really dying? She barely managed to croak out the last word, tears filling her eyes. As far as I know, yes. Could be any day now. No, that can't be true. Hannah shook her head in denial, and then spun her heels and ran out of the room. Slamming her bedroom door behind her, Hannah's fingers trembled as she dialed Jonathan's private line. It rang and rang, with no answer. She tried again, and Jack finally answered, his voice sounding unusually raw. Hi, Hannah. Jonathan is preoccupied, but I'll let him know you called. Hannah's voice shook with anxiety. Jack, tell me the truth. Is something wrong with him? I heard he's sick. Jack paused. Rest assured Mr. Davis is fine. Don't give any credit to blameless rumors. Then put him on the phone. I want to talk to him. I'm sorry, Hannah. He's in a meeting. It's not a good time. It's the middle of the night. Just as Jack began repeating himself, Hannah groaned in annoyance and hung up. She called Latham and Xavier next, but both went straight to voicemail. It was clear that no one was going to tell her what was going on, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. Jonathan had once gotten her an appointment with his personal doctor, and she still remembered where his clinic was. It was a long shot, but it was at least a place to start. Grabbing her coat, Hannah made for the door when Brock's icy voice rang out behind her. Where are you going in the middle of the night? I'm going to see him. No, you're not. Hannah turned and glared at him. What's that supposed to mean? That you're my wife, not his, and your responsibility is to our unborn child. Now go back to bed. You don't own me, Brock. A smug grin spread across his mouth. Don't I, though? Hannah clenched her fists in rage, then charged out of the apartment with defiance. She quickly reached the elevator and slammed the button with an open palm. Behind her, Brock's footfalls echoed menacingly. You're making a big mistake, Hannah. The elevator doors opened, and he reached out to grab her arm, but she deftly sidestepped him. Just as they began to close, she slipped through and left an irate Brock standing on the other side. As she began her descent, she heard his voice bellowing through the hollow metal doors that separated them. You'll regret this! She knew that Brock indeed held significant power over her, but he cared far too much about their baby to even hurt her. Besides, her mind was consumed with the image of Jonathan wasting away in a hospital bed with no one around to soothe him. Regardless of what had transpired between them, he was still one of her oldest and closest friends. How could she remain indifferent to his suffering? When Hannah's elevator finally reached the lobby, she exited to find Brock emerging from another one right beside her. She turned and ran in the opposite direction, but just as she reached the threshold of the stairs leading down to the sidewalk, she heard him shout behind her. If you walk out that door right now, you're never coming back through it. Without glancing back, Hannah burst through the front door and onto the steps. Unfortunately, her mind was so consumed with emotional turmoil that she didn't notice the thin layer of snow beneath her feet. Before she even knew what was happening, her foot flew out from under her and she lunged forward, her helpless scream slicing through the night air. Brock had turned his back and was storming back to the elevator when Hannah's sharp cry reached his ears. His heart pounded in his chest and he ran back to the front door, his eyes widening in horror as he saw Hannah sprawled out at the bottom of the staircase. He arrived at her side in a flash, and as he tried to help her up, she winced in pain and clutched her abdomen. Brock looked on helplessly as her face drained of color and she doubled over, moaning as if she'd been stabbed in the gut. "What's wrong, Hannah? Tell me what you're feeling." She struggled to form words through the pain, and a cold wave of fear crashed over Brock as the severity of her injuries became clear. Without wasting another second, he scooped Hannah's trembling body into his arm and sprinted through a side passage toward the underground parking lot. Placing her in the passenger seat, he slid over the hood to the driver's side, floored the gas, and sped off into the night. Hannah heard the roar of the car engine and desperately clawed her way back from the edge of unconsciousness. She glanced over at Brock, and her voice was shaky. "The baby." "This is why I wanted you to stay inside, but would you listen?" Hannah clenched her eyes shut as a fresh wave of pain washed over her. She hadn't wanted a child initially, least of all with Brock. They had no real relationship. She couldn't imagine a child thriving in an environment where the parents viewed each other with suspicion. But as the days passed, she began to feel more and more connected to the baby growing inside of her. She felt its hunger, its weariness, its wonder. And that deep, visceral bond only grew stronger with each passing day. Recently, she'd started narrating stories to it at bedtime, and during her lunch break, she'd put headphones around the baby bump and play piano sonatas into the womb. Until today, arguments with Brock had dwindled to virtually zero. She had even dared to entertain the thought that maybe, just maybe, they could raise the child together. But now... Just then, the searing pain in her abdomen snapped her out of her daze. The fear of losing something precious and irreplaceable overwhelmed her. And despite all evidence to the contrary, she said a silent prayer that the baby she'd come to love would be okay. Her gaze flicked Brock again, his knuckles wide around the wheel. "I'm scared, Brock." He met her gaze, his once steely expression softened by worry. "I am too." A loud banging sound ripped Nancy out of her half-conscious stupor. As she slowly regained her senses, she heard a man shouting on the other side of the passageway. "Damn it! You mean we've sat here for 3 days, freezing our butts off, and we don't even get to kill him ourselves? What matters is he's dead. There's no way anyone could survive this long in these temperatures. He's probably got lost in there and drowned 3 days ago." "You really think the boss will be happy with that? No one's really seen him, right? So I say we get the hell out of here and find ourselves a substitute corpse. You realize what would happen if we got caught lying to him, right? As long as you two idiots keep your mouths shut, we won't. Now do you want to sit down here for the rest of your life, or do it my way?" Their voices soon dwindled, and a few moments later the rhythm of their retreating footsteps faded into silence. Nancy had no idea how long it had been since the last time she moved, but if there was really a chance they had left, she had to try to find out. Unfortunately, her body had grown rigid and weak, and despite numerous attempts, she failed to lift herself off the floor of the tunnel. Flailing around for Zara, she finally found it and powered it on. With only 2% of its power remaining, she sent it into the narrow passageway to scan for any life signs. After an agonizing 2-minute wait, Zara returned and delivered the news that sent a bolt of adrenaline through Nancy's heart. The coast was clear. Mustering every ounce of her willpower, Nancy squeezed back through the opening and emerged into the tunnel entrance. Gazing up at the sewer cap, she stepped onto the ladder leading up to it and dragged herself up a few rungs. But halfway up, her legs gave out, and she went crashing back to the hard cement floor. Nancy was numb to the physical pain, but tears burst from her eyes as she realized she lacked the strength to escape. After everything she'd been through, she couldn't bear the thought that it might all come to an end like this. When her tears finally ran dry, she gazed up through the dislodged sewer cap and watched as a slice of the evening sky shifted from blue to a vibrant shade of red. Just as a rueful smile broke out across her face, Zara's voice unexpectedly chimed in her ear. "Frida detected. 500 meters. A shiver ran through her. Could it be true? Was she hallucinating? 100 meters. She held Zara in front of her and managed to focus her blurry vision just long enough to see that her mind hadn't tricked her. Zara had finally reestablished its connection. As her vision faded to black, she saw the sewer cap get hurled aside, followed by Steve and Norman's faces peering down at her. Nancy had no idea how much time had passed when her eyes finally fluttered open again. She heard machines beeping all around her, and her body felt unbearably heavy. Straining to turn her head, she saw she was lying in a sterile hospital room. A saline drip hung overhead, and beside her, Steve was sleeping awkwardly in a chair. She attempted to speak, but her dry throat could only produce a raspy whisper. "Steve." At the sound of his name, he sprang upright, his bloodshot eyes evidence of who knew how many sleepless nights. "Maria, you're awake." "Water," she managed to croak out. Steve scrambled to provide one, and she drank greedily, a small semblance of vitality finally returning to her face. When the water was finished, she took a deep breath and turned back to Steve. "Am I still in Houston?" "Yes. The doctors put you in a medically induced coma to give your body and mind time to rest. How are you feeling? Are you hungry? I can have someone make you some soup." At the thought of food, her stomach let out a loud rumble, and she and Steve both burst into laughter. "I'll take that as a yes." "You heard the girl. Get her some soup." Steve nodded and hurried out of the room to find a nurse. With Steve gone, Nancy finally noticed Zara on her bedside and picked it up with her free hand. She scanned through the message log, but her heart plummeted when she noticed that Jonathan hadn't responded. Suddenly, she got the irrepressible sense that something was wrong. When Steve returned, she looked up at him with concern etched across her face. "Where's Jonathan? Is something wrong?" Steve's grip on the bowl of soup faltered, but he quickly composed himself and took a seat. "He's still in Mexico. You know how communications are down there, especially after the explosion." A pang of worry gnawed at Nancy, and after she finished the soup, she asked Steve for her phone and tried to call Jonathan. It went straight to voicemail, so Nancy tried Jack, knowing they almost certainly be together. Nancy's heart skipped a beat when the call was quickly answered, but her hopes were dashed just as quickly. The only thing she heard from the other end was silence. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, Jack was imprisoned in a one-room cell with no windows. Brock's med had caught him off guard during the frantic search, and before he was able to alert Norman or Steve, they had stripped him of all communication devices and locked him up. As a cruel bit of irony, they even stocked the room with all the trappings of luxury: fine wines, gourmet food, and luxury bedding, knowing he refused to enjoy any of it. 2 days earlier, Brock, Hannah, and Ashley left the hospital under an oppressive cloud of silence. No one spoke for the entire ride home until they parked in the garage and Ashley opened Hannah's door to assist her. Brock abruptly stepped between them and glared at Ashley. "She can do it herself. Why would she need any assistance anymore?" Ashley scoffed, then pushed Brock aside and took Hannah by the hand, pulling her to her feet. "Thank you," Hannah muttered. A lingering pain in her stomach made her steps uncertain, and as her hand instinctively found its way to her lower abdomen, a deep, profound sadness welled within her. A sudden emptiness that threatened to swallow her whole. But as she glanced up and saw Brock storming toward the elevator, she was suddenly struck with a determined resolve. Her pregnancy had been the only reason for any of this, and now that it was gone, she and Brock had no reason to continue the charade of their marriage. Just as she decided to confront him, he spun around and stormed up to her. "Are you going to make me carry you? It's freezing cold out here, and you need—" Hannah bit her lips and shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, I'm not going up." Brock's eyes narrowed, and a storm of frustration swirled around him. "What do you mean you're not going up? Hannah, you just fell down a flight of stairs and had a miscarriage. You need rest." "I want a divorce. We have nothing left to tie us together." and I can't stand to be with someone who treats me with such casual contempt. Brock paused, calming himself down. Just come upstairs and get some sleep. We'll talk about it in the morning. He put his arm around her, but she pulled away, meeting his gaze for the first time. No, there's nothing to talk about. It's over, Brock. He scoffed in disbelief, and a cruel grin spread across his face. Fine. Go. Find your precious Jonathan, or whatever's left of him. With that, he turned on his heel and left Hannah standing alone in the cold gloom of the parking lot. As Ashley and Brock boarded the elevator, she took a deep breath and turned to him. Why do you have to treat her that way? Don't, Ashley. I've had a long day. So imagine how long hers has been. She paused, shaking her head. You can be such an asshole sometimes. She made her choice, okay? I was going to suggest we try again, but she's too obsessed with Jonathan Davis to listen to her own husband. If it wasn't for him. He trailed off, his sentence hanging in the air like a specter. Ashley narrowed her eyes. If it wasn't for him, then what? Nothing, Brock grumbled. He took a deep breath to rein in his temper, and his voice dropped back to its usual calm timbre. I'm going to be busy starting tomorrow. Not sure how long it'll take. I can tell you're hiding something. Just tell me what's going on. Did they date? Did she meet him behind your back or something? Enough, Ashley. Take care of your own dinner tonight. I'll be eating in my office. The elevator doors opened, and Brock stormed out without another glance. Back downstairs, Hannah trudged out of the underground garage into the stillness of the night. The streets were mostly empty, and as she wandered aimlessly, the chill in the air pricked her skin despite her down jacket. With each step, a dull pain radiated from her gut, in a constant reminder of everything she'd lost. Even the thought of seeing Jonathan had been crowded out by her all-encompassing sadness. Eventually, she slumped onto a park bench and brought her knees up to her chest. How could she explain this to her mother? How would Brock explain it to his? Would he make divorce easy or as painful as possible? As the night deepened, Hannah's body grew progressively colder, finally numbing out the pain in her abdomen. The following afternoon, Brock sat in his office at the Obsidian headquarters, anxiously awaiting a phone call. When it finally rang, he picked it up immediately. Brock, we've cleared up the assets you've requested, but... Brock's eyes narrowed, sparkling with fury. But what? Well, it's going to wipe out all of our cash and put some of our divisions in a real bind. I'm going to put you in a real bind. Now take the $10 billion, buy out Jonathan's little pet company, and burn it to the ground. Do you think you should check with your father? Just do it. Brock slammed the phone down and exhaled. He'd only recently discovered that Jonathan was building up a side company called Bright Star. And though he initially intended to be more surgical in his approach to taking it over, that was before the events of the last 24 hours. Suddenly, Austin burst in and looked at Brock with concern. Acquisitions just called and told me what you're doing. I understand you're angry, Brock, but remember your own advice. Stay calm and think 3 steps ahead. Brock turned to Austin, glaring at him with ferocious intensity. I refuse to let him go unpunished. Jonathan Davis killed my baby. So now, I'm killing his.